Hi, my name's Bren. I'm the Commercial Director from Quadient. It's great to be here at the CUBO conference today, and I hope you're all having a really useful day and lots of information and a great time. I just want to give a little bit of an intro into the future of residence life. Did you know each student probably receives on average about 9 or 10 parcels per month, which creates a big issue for post rooms around universities. Online retail now accounts for greater than 25% of all retail spend in the UK, which is about £120 billion and contributes to more than 3.5 billion parcels shipped around the UK each year. And universities and students are big contributors to that kind of volume. And it will continue to grow and create further challenges for both students and staff. Students want to know that they're going to receive their parcel at a convenient time, that it's going to be secure, it's going to be safe. It's a good news story to receive a parcel. Many students live away from home, so receiving that parcel or that package is a really great thing for them, and it's something they look forward to on a daily basis. Many universities have therefore contacted Quadient to help support with parcel management because of the growth in parcel volume. The image you can see on screen here is a good reflection of what many post rooms in universities experience. And we have installed many solutions that automate the system and parcel management, that provide an audited tracking system for these parcels and enable them to be 24/7 secure. Some of the typical concerns that students tend to have is they can only pick up packages during limited hours of operation in some buildings when they want to get their parcels. Not home when deliveries are made, and no flexibility of pickup point for them. Potential for lost or stolen parcels, which can be a stressful situation. Long lines occur too often, too much lag time. The date the carrier delivers the package, the date the mail services has the package ready for pickup. So all of these things have created issues for students and contributed to a poor experience in the past. Now, what we're trying to do at Quadient is trying to overcome that with our smart locker solutions, which offer that 24-hour convenient collection point that is secure, automated, and in this day and age, contactless, which is a really important part of the process. Large quantity of packages must be stored and kept organized in universities in the post room. Overflowing storage shelves can lead to misplaced packages. Storage shelves and spaces can lead to parcel recipients' personal details being available to others and create GDPR issues for the post room or the university. Moving packages around large buildings or between faculties can also create a risk. Inbound package management consumes too many parcel room issues and also too much of the resource of on-site staff, which is costly to many universities in this day and age. Inconsistent student experience does not help to promote the value of in-hall residence for students. So if you want to inquire about parcel pending by Quadient Smart Lockers, there'll be a few of our team around and available today: Laura Clark, John Hammond, Michael Sargent, Sam McCord, and George Watts. So please remember the names and look out if you just want to have a chat about smart lockers for your university. Thank you and have a great day.
Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome back to CUBO Winter Conference 2021. And this afternoon's session, which is the 5th of our sessions over the course of the day, the future of residence life. So I'm delighted that we are joined by Dr. Ella Nutu Hall, Head of Residence Life for the University of Sheffield, and James Greenwood, Head of Residential Life for London School of Economics. Before we get on to presentations and then conversation with Ella and James, a little bit of housekeeping. So for those that you have been to earlier sessions, yes, it's me again. So I'd like to reach out and say thank you to all of our supporting partners who without their support, we couldn't organise and deliver and facilitate these sessions. So Huge thanks to Campus Life, to Co-op Franchise, to Quadient, who we've just heard from, to Warwick Event Services, Star Res, and Unite Students. So thanks, guys. Your assistance and contributions really appreciated. So the session today is being recorded, so it will be available for all members to access after the event. Quick reminder in terms of our social media competition. So for those of you who are prolific tweeters, please utilize the hashtag CUBO Winter 2021. That's hashtag CUBO Winter 2021. There will be a prize, and the prize winner will be announced at towards the end of our closing session later this afternoon. Q&A wise, so we would like these sessions as much as possible to be interactive. So over the course of James and Ella's presentations, if you have some questions, please add them to the live Q&A section on the portal. Additionally, in between this session and the final session, there's a further opportunity to get involved in reaching out to colleagues and partners, either via the discussion forum or the meeting hub. So I would actively encourage you to do so if you have a little bit of time between the sessions this afternoon. So at this point in time, I'm going to stop talking and I'm going to hand over to James Greenwood, Head of Residential Life, London School of Economics. James, over to you.
Thanks, Phil. So first of all, apologies for the awful photo of me on the screen now, but I thought I'd start the presentation with a bit of fun. So my name's James, and I'm currently the Head of Residential Life at the LSE. Still new to the role, so it's only 4 months really into this role, so I'm still learning. But it's a really interesting time for me transitioning from University of the Arts, which is quite a modern university, to a more traditional university now. So I guess the title of this presentation is very personally relevant to me, the future of residential life, whilst I transition through this slight change. But I'm lucky, really, I should say, that the team that I've joined at LSE are very open to new ways of running residential lives. That's fantastic. So this session will be broken down into 2 halves. The first half will be a presentation by myself, which will be a review of some previous research that I conducted back in 2019, which was entitled Residential Life Industry Professional Survey, which explored residential life programs in the UK, Ireland, and how they were staffed, operated, funded, and really how successful they are. Around 52 institutions took part in that survey, both from the HE sector and also private student accommodation providers too. And based on this research, I'll try and share my own kind of personal observations and any predictions that I can see for the future. And then the second part of today's presentation will be delivered by a good friend of mine, Dr. Ella Nutu Hall from the University of Sheffield, who's going to focus a bit more on some much more recent research that was conducted via CUBO, which is a residential life survey. So it'll be interesting to hear, I guess, if things have changed, and maybe due to the pandemic over the past few years, maybe that's had an impact on the more recent survey. So without further ado, I'll go straight into the research that we found. So the first question really was quite straightforward, and that was, you know, do you employ residential life staff within your service? And through the survey, I found out that about 62% of respondents employed residential life staff in some way or another, either as dedicated roles or as part of their wider remit. There was a 50-50 split from what we saw in terms of the comments and the feedback around those that still had traditional warden and RA systems, versus those that operated kind of more newer models, professional services staff and sometimes students employed as well in those roles. So some quite interesting feedback that we saw just from the initial opening question of the survey. The next part of this delved a bit further into how those staff are rewarded. And so again, it was a 50-50 split really between those that were offering free accommodation or discounted versus those that actually pay for their staff directly for these residential life roles. And I would suspect this directly correlates to more traditional roles usually being advertised with free accommodation, and new staffing models now focusing on full-time res life staff without living accommodation. So you can see the graph there and the stats and figures and some of the comments that we received back. The next bit was actually about residential life programs and more specifically, how they run and what kind of things do you do. So most res life models that we analysed, about 36% were offering events once or twice a month, and 32% were offering something every single week. So about a third of the sector were offering something for their students every single week, which was quite interesting to see, but I thought it'd be a bit higher than that, if I'm quite honest. It was a bit lower than what I was expecting personally. And then the types of residential life events and activities that these institutions offered. So 86% of respondents offered regular local hall events like film nights, etc., that were quite local to that building or that accommodation. And then 80% offered some form of welcome event, which could include also regular kind of cultural activities, as would be expected. 64% offered events outside of their hall, and actually only 10% offered something away from the building in terms of weekend breaks within the UK, which I thought would be a bit higher. And I would say this is something to be explored maybe. Throughout the pandemic and the Zoom kind of fatigue that we've all experienced, I think students are desperate to get away from where they live and where they study. So this could be something more to explore, especially where we've only got 10% of institutions or accommodation providers currently doing this. And then the really interesting stuff. So how do you budget for your residential life programs? And this was quite a touchy subject. Not many institutions were too happy sharing this information. And actually, when I get onto the next slide, it gets even more kind of deeper into this. So 55% of res life programs were funded through being built into student rents. And you'll see the rest of the breakdown there of how they were structured. It was very interesting to see that some institutions received funds from other departments or divisions, like student services, as part of their kind of internal collaboration work and wider school or university strategies, which was very interesting to see, but very rare that took place in terms of funding. And this is where most respondents weren't too happy sharing exactly the amount of funding that was invested, which I think is quite important to share and be open and transparent about. I think we also have to put some of this into context as well in terms of location. So funding obviously will be different based on the accommodation or the university and its location within the UK Ireland. So only around 18% spent around £10 to £20 per student per head per year. Going down kind of the chart in our analysis, 21% were spending around £20 to £40 per year per student. Only 7% were offering upfront £40 to £60 per student per year, and then only 4% at £100 or above, which I personally think is still a very low amount to invest in residential life programs when you look at the program on a per head figure. And when we've got some accommodation providers charging between £20,000 and £25,000 a year potentially for some rooms in central city locations, that's less than 0.5% of what the student pays for the whole year. So it's a very, very low amount. And so the most important bit, and I think this for me is really apparent as well in terms of what we've been through in terms of the pandemic. So do you incorporate wellbeing initiatives into your residential life programs? It was really good to see actually that around 3/4 of all respondents included some form of wellbeing initiatives within their res life programs. I think this will be much higher now, and I think if we rerun this survey post-pandemic, we'd see a slightly different picture. And then the different types of wellbeing campaigns and initiatives do you offer? So with this, we turned the responses into a word cloud, and the common types of feedback that we were getting in terms of wellbeing initiatives and campaigns included things around sexual health, consent, healthy eating, drug awareness, stress, safety and crime advice, and then also life hacks based campaigns. So it's quite interesting to see all of those words come forward as keywords that we use within different wellbeing campaigns. And in terms of communication, it was interesting to see that nearly 90% of respondents still rely on posters and printed materials throughout their accommodation to get across key messages to students. Email and social media was, of course, still right up there as one of the most powerful forms of communications to students. And word of mouth was quite low. It was around 59% of respondents that said word of mouth was used. Again, I think post-pandemic, I think that might change now following Zoom fatigue and students being stuck in their rooms. I know at LSE, we are starting to see a rise in terms of the popularity of word of mouth for communications to our students. So sending ambassadors around buildings and having chats to students now that we can do that a bit more freely is having a much more positive impact for us at London School of Economics. And then getting towards the end of the survey results now, we asked what percentage of students would you estimated you reached, and more than 50% said that they reached at least 50% of their students, which I think is quite good. Around 22% suggested it was 50 to 70%, and nearly 20% say that they reached over 90% of their students, which I think is extremely impressive. It's quite hard to reach students, so that data for me was quite positive actually to see. And then at the end of this survey, we had some open comments, which you can see on the screen there. Obviously, I won't go through all of them, but a large number of comments suggested that most respondents were in the early days of setting up residential life programmes, or were going through a bit of a review period. So that was quite interesting to find out. And then just getting to kind of the end of my presentation now, just some future predictions and some observations that I made throughout this this survey, but also just my discussions within the industry with lots of different professionals. I think we're seeing a change in traditional residential life roles. I think more and more universities are moving away from traditional living wardens towards more professional out-of-hours services. And linking more into wellbeing services, and maybe even employing full-time experts rather than having wardens where they've got alternative kind of day jobs, which that means that they can focus solely on their expert area. I think that there was discussions earlier today actually around pandemic learnings, and I think, you know, we have to look at what have we learned from the pandemic. Joe mentioned in the opening speech about COVID bonuses, and I think that in terms of the pandemic, we've learned that digital events are here and they exist, and they're probably here to stay, or should we say maybe they're here as more of a blended offering going forward. I personally saw that we reached a lot more students that might be a bit more introverted throughout the pandemic, and those students were able to now take part in some of our events and activities through a digital or virtual way. I also think there's quite a lot of lessons to be learned from the US and the way that things are run in terms of residential life across the US, the development and application of US models. We're seeing a rise in talent as well, I think, coming from the US to the UK. So through partnerships like a QOI and with that, the adaptation of US-centric res life models to the UK. We're also, right from the top of our institution, seeing a bit of a change in terms of structure and branding. So an example would be Vice-Chancellor roles changing to presidents or directors to attract and appeal more to markets outside of the UK. So I think we'll see more of a push, I guess, of those good practice models from the US to the UK. Again, I guess linked to the US, and if that has more of a push in the future, university choice. We've seen, and some of the research suggests that a lot of students across the US will make part of their university choice and decision based on that campus res life experience and whether they feel happy and at home on the campus. So that could come to the UK, and it might already be a thing, actually, to be quite fair, for some universities, especially where a student is selecting a university based on its location or feel-good factor rather than the ratings of a said academic programme. I think in terms of planning, if you're thinking about res life programmes right now, I think it's really important to be flexible with strategy and long-term planning. Residential life and residential life programmes can change so quickly, so we must stay on trend to be successful. So it's important to try and keep those res life strategies as flexible as possible within long-term planning. And obviously, I think we try and say this all the time and bang on about listening to the students. I'm not sure whether we all fully do it all the time, but we all try our best, obviously. I think it's really important to continue listening and through focus group surveys and keep doing these as often as you can, keep refreshing them and listen to what the students are saying, really, and provide exactly what they want and exactly how they want it. And that's it from me. I'm going to hand over, hopefully now, to Ella. Thank you.
I think actually you're going to come back to me briefly whilst we tee up Ella's presentation in the background. So thanks, James. Really interesting to hear about your reflections. So I run the risk of getting into Q&A before I should do, but I am going to ask you a quick question actually for comment on. So the slide around funding is quite interesting in terms of that sliding scale and volume of cash that's assigned to res life across those 52 institutions. In isolation, and I've been there and I've felt it, in isolation, res life programs can often be viewed as quite costly. How best do you think we can articulate the sort of the cost benefit and return on investment when we're having those conversations internally?
Yeah, I think first of all, they don't have to be costly. I think you can be quite creative with resources. And one of the key things that I've done in the past is share resources across the university. I know when I was at University of the Arts, we worked quite closely with lots of different departments that already had services and facilities that we could tap into and share back out across residencies. So they don't always need to cost money or too much money. But I think it links back to what I said before around speaking to students and surveying students, and not just wait until the end of the year, continuously do that throughout the year and use some of those stats and figures to prove exactly return on investment. But res life is very hard. I think it's one of the hardest parts of commercial services to show value for money for. So I think it always will be a tough one for us to suggest, return on investment. And
Yeah, absolutely. That's great. Thank you very much. Right, at this point, it gives me great pleasure to hand over to Dr. Ella Nutu Hall, Head of Residence Life at the University of Sheffield. Ella, over to you.
Thank you very much, Phil, and thank you, James, for that presentation. It was really fascinating, and certainly I'm going to pick up on some of the things that you've actually mentioned as we look at the future. And just in case you're wondering, no, I do not have a crystal ball, but I'd like to actually bring in focus some of the steer that we certainly are receiving from UK, for example, particularly in terms of the step change mentally healthy universities, because that certainly indicates the direction of travel for universities in general, but certainly for residence life departments and services. This was actually based on the Student Minds, the University Mental Health Charter, and certainly at the core of it is the fact that we need to create universities as health settings. Yes, the pandemic will have actually had quite a lot in terms of pushing us into this direction, the pandemic and the shared anxiety that we have all experienced. But also there seems to be a dilution of boundaries between students and staff that is actually here required. So certainly in terms of health settings, there seem to be places or social contexts in which people engage in daily activities where environmental, organizational, and certainly personal factors interact to affect health and well-being. So in the words of the World Health Organization, health is created and lived by people within the settings of their everyday life, where they learn, work, play, and love. So you see what I mean in terms of those boundaries. I think so we're moving away from silos, from boundaries, into what can very easily be described as intersectionality. So the core of the step change will focus on the whole university approach. And that will actually be built on 4 pillars, 4 domains: the work, learn, support, and live domains. And certainly from a university accommodation and residence life perspective, it's very easy for us to consider the domain live, because that is where we deliver our service, obviously both in terms of setting, physical setting, but also in terms of our scope and strategy, because obviously all of these strands that come together, including the health promotion. James already was talking about so many initiatives that we institutions actually are supporting and facilitating, from sexual consent to mental health awareness to race equality conversations and all of those. But also where we encourage healthy behaviors, physical activity, sleeping, and we discourage unhealthy behaviors through conduct responses, and creating that healthy culture, healthy environment, etc. This is where we excel, as I was saying. So many of the initiatives that we actually put out there, both in terms of community building, but also in terms of education, when it comes to trying to encourage our students to respect codes of conduct and understanding how their behavior impacts on their neighbors, on the wider community. But at the core is that sense of community. And certainly we've learned a lot. And I remember a few years back standing in front of colleagues and saying sexual consent is going to be massive, and it certainly is. But the other thing that is likely to become even more important is an expectation that accommodation, particularly residence life services, will enable inclusivity. And some of you know that here at Sheffield, we took the risk some years ago to create LGBTQ accommodation, which attracted quite a bit of national media interest. But because we've had the support of the Students' Union and that collaboration really paid off, we are now running very successful scheme where this is not a ghetto, but it's an opt-in, because we understand that for certain demographics of our students, where they live, the environment, particularly, consider trans students, the environment is so important to them in terms of enabling them to apply themselves to their studies, to grow and develop as individuals. But I think we also need to consider beyond that, some requirements that are linked to disability. For example, here at Sheffield, we are going to launch a new pilot community, a quiet accommodation to cater to autistic students and, possibly students who just simply prefer quite a lifestyle, etc. So we will see how that works. But I think the care that we have to take is to make sure that these interventions, these projects are not seen in terms of vulnerability. We don't want students to think, okay, that's the disabled block, for example, but rather to see them as opportunities for creating an environment where all our students can flourish, all our students can grow, and indeed staff. And that is something that we need to consider more widely again. And certainly the hybrid models of working, for example, have benefited members of staff immensely. So that's one example. So inclusivity would be really very much in focus in the future. The other domain that we are likely to see very close connections to is that support. Obviously, so many of our staff are mental health first aid trained, for example, because mental health has actually been something that we have really paid attention, very close attention to for some years now. But I think this will actually also go beyond the mental health support and its support to victims of sexual violence, for example. So now our team are SVLO trained, so there are sexual violence liaison officers, and together with colleagues from Central Student Support Services, we staff the SVLO service at the university, which strictly speaking is actually available not just to students, even though they actually form the large majority of our cases at the moment, but also staff. So again, we're seeing that the blurring of boundaries between staff and students and the move towards the one university, whole university approach, one community. And working with secondary care and tertiary care when needed in terms of the NHS and the wider support. And from that, also in terms of strategy, we here at Sheffield have created a suicide mitigation policy. And again, that actually reflects not just student support services, but also our colleagues in HR that is available to all. But it's certainly something that is going to be required of universities to consider this idea of the suicide safer universities as in communities. And then we actually, again, I've also mentioned staff. The domain work is also growing in terms of the necessary work that we need to do, because we need to create opportunities for staff to feel equipped to deliver the service. And it's interesting because, James already mentioned the pressures that we've actually all found under during the pandemic. And we have actually had to look after ourselves, but also deliver a service. And the needs of our students are increasingly complex year after year, but certainly they've been very complex over the past 2 years. And so we need to make sure that our staff are trained and feel equipped in terms of delivering the service, and understanding boundaries is absolutely massive. And here at Sheffield, we're also looking at creating training modules, not for the practitioners, but also for people in whose daily work lives may encounter some incidents that may actually have an impact on their mental health. For example, cleaners who may actually walk into a situation where they witness a student self-harming, for example, and there's blood and their concerns, all of that. So we're trying to actually create that environment where staff feel equipped, but where also they understand boundaries and they're supported by managers. And that is very, very important. Because in the words of Professor Sir Gary Cooper at Manchester, we believe there is nothing more important than investing in the health and well-being of employees to create more good days at work, because healthier, happier people can do great things. And it's simple. A business filled with happier people having good days at work is better business. That's not too revolutionary if you think about it. And yes, it is not revolutionary at all. But what is interesting is that this is actually coming from UUK, and there's a very clear and transparent steer towards our responsibility when it comes to supporting our staff. But what about student staff? And we were talking about the pressures on our students, but obviously when it comes to employing our students, yes, we actually create development opportunities for them, but certainly in terms of the students who find themselves in peer support roles, we also need to acknowledge the impact that that will have on themselves, on their own mental health. And here I really must extend my thanks to CUBO, and particularly Sarah Clayton, who's actually facilitated this survey that we've undertaken, because what we have experienced here is a decline in interest in peer support roles and within the residential setting. So essentially, we have employed students in the resident life mentor role for many years now. And over the past 2 or 3 years, we've seen a significant decline in interest. We've had fewer and fewer applications year upon year, and we try to understand whether that was actually that we were experiencing in isolation or whether that was something that other institutions experienced. So thank you very much to Sarah. And we can actually share the results in full, but here are a few highlights that I'd like to concentrate on. So when we actually asked whether other institutions noticed a decline in the number of applications for the role, over 40% of the respondents indicated that yes, they had experienced a decline, and I'm very happy for the over 50 who didn't. It's amazing. So I think you really should pat yourself on the back and consider yourself very fortunate indeed. We're certainly not amongst you. When we asked our colleagues to actually perhaps identify some potential contributing factors, we've had a number of suggestions. Last year was really hard for the team. For example, I think this put people off applying, and also depending on the site that'll be posted, the job can be all about events and all about welfare, or all about antisocial behavior. So again, this reflects what we have experienced, that increase in the complexity of the role for student staff. Others suggested more focus on study, perhaps less concerned with perks or free accommodation. Then COVID, before this, we had hundreds of applications, unsurprisingly. And then initially we had a large decline because the halls of residence place was no longer attracting applicants, and all halls of residence becoming more expensive. Again, that implication that because they have to live in and they consider university accommodation slightly more expensive, it seems that the role has lost its appeal. We removed the requirement to live in, so applicants could live in private accommodation, and applications increased significantly. And so that's an interesting way of dealing with that. We had seen a decline year on year. We changed our offer from a rent rebate to free accommodation and had the most applications since 2015. So that seems to work. So obviously the perks linked to accommodation seem to really make an impact. Again, COVID-related, feedback in terms of reduced visibility on site that has actually put us back, and we're trying to reestablish ourselves in the university community, which is very, very astute comment there. But I think for me, an excellent comment is that the role of the RA or the residential mentor, certainly student staff, is getting more difficult each year due to the increasing mental health awareness from students, and better support is required for RAs to carry out their role, and also to ensure that they're supported and have tools to be resilient and set boundaries. And again, if anything can illustrate the blurring of boundaries, is certainly the student peer support roles in accommodation, because they are both students and staff. And that happens also in academic departments, with PhD students, for example, who are, involved in teaching and everything else. But certainly within residence life, that is a very clear example of where the boundaries are blurred, and we really need that whole one university approach where staff and students are treated in similar ways. When we looked at the rewards that students in peer support roles received, most of them were actually paid, as you can see. Also, free accommodation was part of the picture. I was actually fascinated to see that the difference, that there was very little little difference between the paid and the free accommodation responses. And then also there was a rent rebate. And that was actually very helpful for us when we reviewed our role, and certainly the rewards that we are offering our student staff for next year. And we really wanted to advertise as soon as possible for next September. And I think what I'd like to say is to conclude with this, in the sense that we need to enable co-production. James mentioned that idea of listening to our students, talking to them. And I think it goes beyond the students. I think there's a co-production for both staff and students, because we need to be able to actually provide those opportunities that would inform perspective from a strategic point of view. We need to consult with our staff and our students, and we need to encourage that involvement, taking an active role in very defined activities. Boundaried activities also help, because that would also encourage participation and collaboration and joint decision-making. No decision about me without me is certainly the motto, it seems, and that has to be at the basis of strategy development and everything else for the future. And so here it is. I really wanted to make sure that we had time for questions. That's by no means, you know, everything that will actually happen next, but certainly this seems to be the direction of travel, and things that we will actually find that we need to face and respond to, because these are great challenges.
Ella, that's great. Thank you very much. Again, really insightful. We've done very well today over the course of the session. So the level of insight and engagement in the session has been fantastic. So thank you very much for that. So in terms of questions, so again, I would encourage colleagues to add any questions onto the live Q&A. There are a couple on there. So if I just go to the first one, bear with me for a moment.
I wonder whether I may take this opportunity to perhaps add to James's response to your question earlier in terms of funding Residence Life Department.
Absolutely. Let's start there. Yeah, please feel free.
While our audience are putting together more questions. In our experience, James already said that residence life is actually something that is very difficult to quantify. How do we define success? Nobody committed suicide today, just to be crass, but really, essentially, that's what we're facing. How do we quantify the success of our service, that well-being that we facilitate? And so we've had to actually think of very clear ways in which we could identify that, and we looked at learning outcomes and learning themes within our service. So everything that we deliver, whether it's a well-being initiative, whether it's a conduct meeting, or whether it's an event, to do with sports or yoga, everything is linked to a learning theme and specific learning outcomes. And we've actually encourage our students to give us feedback linked to that, because that's something that we're very keen to facilitate, and that is learning amongst our residents, for them themselves to realize quite how much they're growing and developing by living in university accommodation and benefiting from a residence life model. And we've benchmarked against ourselves, and so that's why we've convinced our university that they really should pay us from core funds rather than just mere rent. So our events and activities are funded through the rent, but all the support and the conduct aspect of the service are funded directly from the same funds that would actually cover academics, as well as central student support services, and the GP practice and counselling services, all of that. So we have that recognition, but it really takes time, and having the Students' Union on your side and having a collaboration with them also helps.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you very much. So I'm going to ask a question that I had then, actually. So, and I don't know whether this is a controversial one or not. It's sort of linked. So given that challenge in terms of funding, given the challenge, James, that you mentioned earlier in terms of Res Life more often than not are connected through commercial services, accommodation services, given the additional complexity that's coming over the hill, or actually is here, and that we're hearing from students, and the challenges around recruitment and so on and so forth, and upweighting of skill, and probably particular focus around mental health and well-being and so on and so forth. Would residential life services more generally be better aligned with student services as a function than commercial services? Ella, I'm going to ask you that question first.
Yes and no. And I can say that because I know that my boss is in the audience and he knows how I feel. But there are always going to be tensions for residence life, and certainly in terms of the strategy, the scope, in terms of training, there may be tensions in which, you know, we might actually find ourselves stuck between a rock and a hard place with a foot in both camps. For example, you know, if there is a strategy towards training, and if there is to be a fair approach to training all staff in the same department. Our training, for example, tends to be very, very expensive. SVLO training is expensive. Mental health first aid training is expensive. So, you know, there could be those tensions. And that's why we're very fortunate at Sheffield that we don't rely necessarily on directly departmental funds, because we are funded from central services, and that really helps to mitigate that tension. And having said that, so in terms of scope, in terms of, you know, links through AMORCHE, through student support services, you know, we're already seen as a bit of a satellite of student support services, but within accommodation and commercial services. So having said that, I don't think we would be as efficient as at delivering our service if we weren't placed within accommodation and commercial services. I'll be interesting to see in, you know, any reactions from colleagues who've actually recently experienced a transition of their residence life department from accommodation into central services. But I think, again, it's part of the one university, whole university approach. We benefit immensely from working so closely with our colleagues in accommodation services, because we know we have that relationship with them, and we understand what students experience, where they live, what the limitations are, what the challenges are. We need to work closely with the porters. We need to work closely with the cleaners to understand what's happening on the ground. So this is why I say yes and no. And so strategically, potentially yes, but then in practice, operationally, I think we would actually face greater challenges if we weren't within the accommodation services, I have to say. But again, we're very fortunate because of the financial model, budgeting model here serves us well. So we're very lucky in that sense here. But yes, I can understand the challenges.
Absolutely, that's great. Thank you, James. Anything to add in terms of that question?
I think quite similar, you know, operationally, we operate within residential services and accommodation very differently to central services like student services. I think that there is benefit maybe though in looking at sharing some staffing across each of those services, and that's, I know, areas that some universities do, like wellbeing staff. Traditionally, we know that a lot of student services and counselling teams tend to work 9 to 5 and don't fully understand the 24/7 operation of residential services. So a share of staffing in the future might be something to look at. I think that would be a key area for me.
Yeah, absolutely.
And if I may, I agree with James, and that's why we work really closely with student support services. And so I mentioned the SVLO service, the Sexual Violence and Liaison Officer service. We staff it together. So we work across, you know, we already blurring those boundaries. When it comes to support, we're just interested in delivering the best service to the students. We've represented on the risk assessment panel for the university. We sit on the university student support committee. So again, we don't feel isolated. I think, yes, we are very fortunate at Sheffield because already we've taken that on board of the whole university approach. So we benefit immensely from that collaboration.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm really conscious of time, we're overrunning, but there's one question, so I'm going to table it to you both, but I'm going to ask you to answer it as succinctly as you can. And for those people who've added questions that we haven't got round to, we will get you an answer and we'll come back out to you. So I have a question from Jenny Shaw. So it's a big question, but it needs a short answer. How can private providers best approach res life so they don't have the additional sources of funding for it in the same way as we're able to leverage through universities, and have to work closely with the university for pathways to welfare services? So what would you like to see private providers doing in this space, I guess?
Can I go first?
Oh, sorry.
James, you go.
Okay. I'll keep it as short as I can. So I think that thanks, first of all, Jenny, and it's lovely that you're here watching today. I think that a key part of that is planning and planning for the future, and private accommodation providers being part of those discussions with universities, especially where there's an agreement where the whole building is for a certain institution. And so I think that is really crucial for the future of residential life within those NOMS agreements, or whatever the agreement might be. But yeah, the accommodation provider needs to be there early days as part of that discussion, and actually try and mirror what's going on across the rest of the university, or some of the university run accommodation, so that it doesn't feel like a disconnection, and so that students still feel part of that one umbrella and one approach to student experience. So that would be my one key bit.
Thanks, James. And Ella?
I would suggest speak to the university. You may have noticed in my presentation, the UK steers that the universities really have to look into the the live domain, so where students live and how best to facilitate support where they live. I'd say speak to the university, speak to the students' union, the guilds, see if you can actually get support, because and ultimately you'll still have to consider a budget for it, because obviously it doesn't come cheap. But yeah, just reach out, Student Support Services in the universities.
That's great. Thank you both again for your contribution. It's very much appreciated. Thanks to everybody that's joined the call. And I think we did really well there, actually. You guys were really engaging, and we've kept pretty much everybody that was there at the beginning, despite the fact that we've overrun. So thank you again. So I'm going to draw it to a close there. And just my sort of closing remark would be, we have our final session starting at 3:30. So please feel free to join us for that session. So, and thank you again. Keep well, everybody.